For more on this and what's happening around the rest of the world, Greg Sheridan, the foreign editor at The Australian, joins me now. Greg, thanks very much for your time. I think one of the interesting questions out of the Hong Kong elections, I'm interested in your take. We assumed, I think, before the elections, eventually the protest movement would be crushed in some way, if that's not being too blunt. Is this a game changer?
Look, it's a very significant development, Tom. It's still extremely difficult to see how the situation goes forward. Some of the demonstrators took a bad road of violence, attacking civilians who disagreed with them, creating large numbers of Molotov cocktails and everything. I just don't think there's any future in that. But this was a tremendous reassertion by the people of Hong Kong that they want democratic reform and that they prize democracy even above short-term economic benefit. I don't think the overwhelming majority of Hong Kongers favour violent tactics at all, and it's very good to see the demonstrations today have resumed their more peaceful quality. But the demonstrators lack a leader, they lack a negotiating strategy, and the Hong Kong administration lacks all power. This is intensely embarrassing to Beijing because it's the one part of the massive nation of China which had a free vote any time recently, and it voted 9-1 against Beijing. So I don't think Beijing is going to give any concessions, nor do I think it's likely that they're going to come in with a massive show of force. So the most you can surmise out of it is continuing stalemate, I think. I mean, it does make it trickier. If they do want to bring things to a head, everyone will be pointing to this election result now. So it's certainly an advantage there for the protesters. To our relationship with China more broadly, Greg, it's in the spotlight. Where do we sit at the end of the week? Are we just waiting now to see what happens with the protection of this Chinese spy or intelligence officer and any consequences from that? I think this was a historic week, Tom, to overuse what can be a cliche. This marked the end of an era in Australia-China relations. The guy who says he's a Chinese intelligence officer, maybe he was exaggerating his position a bit, but people who have dealt with him tell me that this is a very, very desperate guy who certainly worked for the Chinese government. And the Taiwanese have undertaken arrests based on his information. There seems to be prima facie a good deal of substance here. The other allegations that the Chinese were attempting to engineer a candidate into Parliament, the statements from Duncan Lewis that the Chinese want to take over Australian politics. Of course, they're an infinitely long distance from doing that. The confirming statements from Nick Warner, the head of the Office of National Intelligence, that he backs Duncan Lewis's remarks. The remarks by the former ASIO boss Dennis Richardson that the Chinese try to hack everything that moves in Australia. I mean, these are very serious institutional actors and they are making very serious assessments about what Beijing is doing. That doesn't mean we're going to go to war or anything insane. It just means we're going to have a much more messy, competitive, difficult relationship than we've had at any time since 1972. I think we have to get used to the idea that there will be political competition and strategic competition, and we still need to protect our positive interests and be as positive as we can be every time that we're allowed to be. So this is a much more challenging... This week we entered a new era in our relations with China. It's going to be very messy and very, very challenging.
But you do sense a lot of people are welcoming that there's no sense of any sort of naivety on the side of Australia anymore if there was before. Let's turn to the UK election. I'm just going to play, first of all, for our viewers, the latest development here. Jeremy Corbyn under fire, the chief rabbi in the UK accusing Labor and Corbyn of anti-Semitism. He denies that charge and he won't apologise. Have a look.
There is no place whatsoever for anti-Semitism in our society, our country, or in my party, and there never will be so long as I'm leader of the party. And since I became leader of the party has adopted processes that didn't exist before.
So, Greg, this is having a big impact on the election right now. The charge of anti-Semitism, it seems to come from his Corbyn support, for example, for Palestinian military groups. I mean, are we talking about a policy debate here or a word that's being used to label him?
No, this was a devastating intervention by the Chief Rabbi, and it seems to have cut through in a way that this issue hasn't cut through in the past. The Chief Rabbi is not a political figure. He never gets involved in politics. And his charge that Labor is now riddled with the poison of anti-Semitism, which is sanctioned from the top, sanctioned by Jeremy Corbyn, was supported by the Archbishop of Canterbury, by other Anglican bishops, by Hindu, Sikh and even Muslim religious leaders in Britain. 9 Labor MPs have resigned because of British Labor anti-Semitism. Luciana Berger, the Jewish female Labor MP who resigned recently, says the Labor Party is now systematically anti-Semitic. Corbyn is the most comprehensively unfit figure ever to be considered for national leadership in a major Western nation. He has a record of decades of support for anti-Semitic figures, anti-Semitic campaigns. He went on Iranian TV in a paid segment and, you know, criticised the BBC for its pro-Israel bias, which was evident, he said, in its view that Israel had a right to exist. This is before he became leader, of course. He praised a viciously anti-Semitic mural which showed hook-nosed Jewish capitalists breaking the backs of workers. He hailed as his friends committed terrorists dedicated to murdering Jews. Now, what you see is the pathology of the modern left, which regards itself as being a champion against racism, but it defines racism as a structural problem growing organically out of the nature of Western society. So it cannot identify racism when it sees it in front of its face, and it thinks because it opposes the structural characteristic of the West, it is thereby opposing all racism. This hatred of Jews is a very ancient, toxic hatred in the West. It's fuelled now by Islamists, by the far right, by the lingering after effects of traditional Christian anti-Semitism, and now by the left. And this intervention by the Chief Rabbi is on the front page of every British newspaper. Jeremy Corbyn looked like Prince Andrew saying, "What, me? I've never done anything wrong. I'm a good person. I can't do anything wrong." He just doesn't get it, and that is the pathology of the modern left. I hope that it causes him to lose a lot of votes, but you never know.
You do never know. Support surged just before the last election for him, at the moment languishing in the polls. But look, predicting Brexit and what's happening over there, Greg, has been a fraught exercise. We will see. Thank you for your time today.
Thanks a lot, Tom.